The wind carried the scent of damp earth and cut hay as Daniel Harker trudged through the vast, moonlit field, cursing under his breath at his misfortune. His old truck had sputtered its last breath a few miles back, stranding him on a dirt road with nothing but an empty phone battery and the knowledge that the nearest house was at least an hour's walk away. He had been on his way back from his brother's place, deep in the countryside of Montana, where farmland stretched for miles with little more than rusted barbed wire fences and the occasional oak tree to break up the landscape. The night was silent, save for the chirping of distant crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves stirred by the cool autumn breeze. The darkness felt strangely heavy, pressing in from all sides, making the vast openness of the field feel more like a closed room with walls of shadows stretching to the heavens. He kicked at the dirt in frustration, glancing back in the direction of his truck, now a distant silhouette against the dim glow of the horizon. There was no use turning back. It wouldn't start no matter how many times he pounded the dashboard in frustration. His only option was to keep walking, cutting across the field in hopes of reaching the nearest farmstead faster than if he stuck to the winding road. The stars overhead burned bright, untainted by city lights, yet there was something about the sky that made him uneasy. He had lived in Montana his whole life, knew the night skies well, but tonight, they felt different. The constellations appeared oddly misplaced, as though they had shifted just slightly out of order, and there was an unnatural stillness that made the air feel thick, almost electric. That's when he heard it, the low, humming vibration, so faint at first that he thought it was his imagination. But within seconds, it grew in intensity, reverberating through his bones like the distant roar of a coming storm. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as he instinctively froze, scanning the horizon. There were no headlights, no signs of an approaching vehicle, and yet the sound continued to swell, pulsing in waves that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The wind stopped. The crickets went silent. The world seemed to hold its breath as Daniel slowly turned his gaze upward. A glow. Faint at first, then more pronounced, a shifting, pulsating light hovering in the sky, impossibly bright yet casting no distinct shadows. It wasn't a plane. It wasn't a helicopter. It moved with an eerie smoothness, drifting silently above the field before stopping abruptly, hovering motionless like a predator studying its prey. Daniel's breath caught in his throat as his instincts screamed at him to run, but his legs refused to obey. The humming sound deepened, resonating within his skull, making his vision blur at the edges. It was as if the air itself was vibrating with an unseen energy, wrapping around him, holding him in place. Then, the light expanded. It wasn't a beam, not like a flashlight or a searchlight. It was a presence, an all-consuming radiance that swallowed the darkness around it, stretching toward him with an unnatural pull. His body tingled, a strange sensation washing over him, like a static charge before a lightning strike. A pressure built in his chest, his heartbeat hammering erratically as the force intensified, rooting him to the spot. His mind raced. Was this some kind of military experiment? A drone? A hallucination brought on by exhaustion? But none of those explanations accounted for the sheer wrongness of what he was witnessing. His muscles twitched involuntarily as the glow encased him. The field, the distant tree line, the night sky, all of it blurred into an indistinct haze as his feet left the ground. The world tilted, spinning in slow motion as gravity lost its grip. His limbs flailed uselessly in the air, panic setting in as he realized he was being lifted, pulled upwards by an unseen force. A scream built in his throat, but the sound never left his lips. The pressure in his skull grew unbearable, an invisible weight pressing down on his thoughts, filling his mind with an overwhelming sensation of stillness. He wanted to fight, to struggle, but his body betrayed him, stiffening as if submerged in deep water. Higher. Higher. The field shrank below him, its golden stalks bending in rippling waves beneath the energy that surrounded him. His mind struggled to grasp what was happening, but the rational part of him, the part that had always believed in the explainable, the logical, was slipping away. He could see the craft now, a massive, disc-like shape with an intricate pattern of glowing symbols tracing its surface. It wasn't metal, at least not in the way he understood metal to be. It shimmered like liquid silver, its form shifting subtly, as if refusing to be defined by any one shape. A pulse of blue light erupted from its center, and suddenly, everything went white. His thoughts dissolved, his senses collapsed inward, and the world ceased to exist. Then nothing. Darkness wrapped around Daniel like a thick, suffocating fog. He was aware of his body but couldn't move, couldn't even tell if he was still floating or if he had been placed somewhere solid. His consciousness flickered like a dying bulb, trapped between wakefulness and oblivion, until the void surrounding him began to shift. A faint blue glow cut through the black, pulsing in rhythmic waves, growing brighter with each heartbeat. Then came the sound, an unsettling, low-frequency hum that vibrated through his bones, as if the entire atmosphere was alive with an unseen force. His senses sharpened in an instant. The air, or whatever passed for air in this space, felt thick and charged, as if infused with pure energy. The blinding light that had swallowed him outside the field was gone, replaced by a dim, eerie luminescence that radiated from the very walls around him. He wasn't floating anymore. He was lying on something cold and smooth, though when he turned his head slightly, the surface beneath him rippled like liquid metal, shifting with his movements. His heart pounded as he tried to push himself upright, but an invisible force held him in place, pressing down on his chest with just enough pressure to keep him still. His breathing quickened, panic clawing at his mind. He tried to call out, but his voice refused to cooperate. His limbs tingled, his fingers barely responding as he struggled against whatever unseen restraint was pinning him down. Then, a shadow moved in the periphery of his vision. Not a shadow, something solid. Someone, or something, was there. A figure emerged from the hazy blue light, its form tall and unnaturally slender. At first, Daniel thought it was a man, but as it stepped closer, his stomach twisted with an instinctual dread. The being stood at least 7 feet tall, its body elongated and impossibly smooth, with limbs that seemed slightly too long for its narrow torso. Its skin, if it could be called skin, was an ashen gray, tinged with an iridescent sheen that shifted subtly as it moved. Its head was disproportionately large, tapering to a sharp point at the back, and its eyes, black, glossy, and devoid of pupils, stared at him with an intelligence that felt ancient, unreadable. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He had seen depictions of greys in conspiracy theories and sci-fi movies, but this was no Hollywood fantasy. This was real. Too real. Every instinct in his body screamed that he was not meant to be here, that he was in the presence of something far beyond human understanding. The figure tilted its head slightly, its gaze piercing through him as if peeling away his very essence layer by layer. Then, without moving its lips, a voice, or rather, a presence, filled his mind. "You are awake!" The words were not spoken aloud, yet they echoed through his consciousness as if they had always been there, waiting to be unlocked. A cold sweat broke across his skin as he tried to shake his head, tried to deny what was happening, but the force pressing him down remained unwavering. The being took another step forward, and Daniel became aware of more figures emerging from the shadows. 3, 4, 6 of them, their movements eerily synchronized, surrounding him in a silent, unblinking vigil. The air grew heavier. His vision swam, his thoughts unraveling as something foreign slipped into his mind, an intrusion that sent a sharp, electric shock through his nerves. He gasped, his back arching involuntarily as flashes of memories. His childhood home, his first car, his mother's voice calling his name, were pulled from the depths of his subconscious without his consent. The beings were rifling through his mind like one would sift through pages of an open book. "You do not understand." The phrase was not a question but a statement, laced with something that could almost be mistaken for curiosity. A new sensation gripped Daniel's skull, an expanding pressure, like something vast and incomprehensible was being forced into his mind, stretching the boundaries of his understanding to their limits. Visions erupted before his eyes, flickering too fast to grasp. Cities crumbling, oceans rising, the earth seen from a distance, engulfed in a swirling mass of light and darkness. The images burned into his thoughts, seared into his very being with an intensity that bordered on unbearable. He wanted to scream. He wanted to fight. But he was drowning in a sea of thoughts that were not his own, trapped in a storm of knowledge that threatened to rip him apart. The beings around him remained still, watching, waiting, as if gauging his reaction. The realization hit him like a hammer. They were testing him. A new wave of pain shot through his skull, and the vision shattered, leaving him gasping for breath. The pressure eased slightly, and his body sagged against the metallic surface beneath him. His mind reeled, struggling to piece together what was happening, but the more he tried to comprehend, the more fragmented reality became. The lead figure took a step closer, its elongated fingers rising slowly, hovering just above his forehead. The air between them crackled with unseen energy, sending shivers down Daniel's spine. "You will see," the voice whispered in his mind. And then, everything went black. Darkness gave way to a dull, pulsating glow, the air thick with an electric charge that made Daniel's skin prickle. His consciousness drifted in and out, his body weightless yet restrained, as if caught between waking and an endless void. His mind felt fractured, scattered like shards of broken glass, each thought slipping away the moment he tried to grasp it. The voices, if they could be called voices, were still there, whispering through the unseen fabric of his thoughts, not in words but in raw sensations that made his skull throb with each pulse of their presence. He tried to move. He couldn't. His arms and legs were held in place by something unseen, something that wasn't touching him but still prevented any motion. Panic surged through him, but his body refused to respond the way it should. The walls around him shimmered with an eerie, liquid-like glow, their color shifting in waves between silver and an unnatural shade of violet. The space was vast, but there were no clear edges, just an endless, fluid structure that seemed to reshape itself with every flicker of light. The ceiling stretched high above him, filled with an array of symbols that pulsed in perfect rhythm with his heartbeat. And then, they appeared again. The beings stepped into view, emerging seamlessly from the surrounding light as if they had been part of it all along. They moved without sound, their elongated forms gliding effortlessly as they encircled him. No footsteps, no breathing, just the oppressive weight of their presence. Their black, pupilless eyes studied him, unblinking, as though dissecting his very essence. Daniel wanted to scream, to demand answers, but the moment he tried to open his mouth, a suffocating force clamped down on his voice, silencing him before a single sound could escape. The tallest figure, clearly the one in control, lifted a spindly hand. A thin, metallic instrument emerged from the surrounding wall, extending toward him with an unnatural fluidity. It hovered just inches above his chest, its needle-thin tip glinting under the shifting lights. The moment it made contact, a searing jolt of energy surged through his body, bypassing flesh and bone and going straight to his nervous system. It wasn't pain in the traditional sense, it was worse. His senses exploded outward, his consciousness expanding against his will, stretching beyond the confines of his physical form. Memories surfaced, flashes of his past, his childhood, his greatest joys and deepest fears, all laid bare before these beings like an open book. His mind was no longer his own. He could feel them sifting through his thoughts, their presence brushing against his consciousness like an invasive mist, probing, searching, pulling apart every experience he had ever lived. And then, the memories weren't his anymore. He saw things. Visions that didn't belong to him. A swirling mass of stars and planets, civilizations rising and falling in the blink of an eye. Creatures unlike anything on Earth, some towering and magnificent, others writhing in shadow, their forms shifting in ways that defied logic. He saw an endless corridor of time, stretching far beyond anything he could comprehend, his mind barely able to process the sheer scale of what was being forced upon him. "This is knowledge," the thought whispered through him, though it was not his own. "You were not meant to have it." The beings were not simply examining him. They were downloading him. The realization sent a fresh wave of panic through him. He wasn't just a subject in an experiment, he was a specimen, a data point in something far grander than he could possibly understand. Every cell in his body buzzed with an alien energy, his very DNA unraveling beneath the unseen force that held him in place. It was as if they were scanning him at a level deeper than biology itself, extracting not just physical information but something more, something essential to who he was. A different instrument appeared, this one bristling with tiny filaments that pulsed with faint blue light. It descended toward his forehead, the filaments extending like roots, burrowing into his skin, not physically, but through him, as if phasing into his very thoughts. A sharp pressure filled his skull, followed by a sensation of weightlessness, and then silence. His thoughts were gone. His self was gone. For a brief moment, he was nothing. No memories, no emotions, no identity, just a void where Daniel Harker had once been. He was aware of them, but not of himself. He existed only as an observer, a hollow shell through which the beings moved and examined, a consciousness floating on the fringes of an incomprehensible intelligence. Then, just as quickly as it had been stolen, it was returned. Daniel gasped, his body convulsing as he was thrust back into himself. He was whole again, but different. Something had changed. He could feel it. A lingering presence remained inside him, a whisper at the edge of his consciousness, like an echo of something vast and ancient. He had been touched by something beyond human understanding, and no matter what happened next, he knew he would never be the same. The beings took a step back, their expressions, if they could be called that, remaining unreadable. The tallest one tilted its head, as if considering something, before a final thought pushed into Daniel's mind, heavy with meaning. "You are not ready." And with that, the examination was over. The restraints vanished. The instruments withdrew. And as Daniel's vision blurred once more, he knew that whatever came next would be worse than anything he had endured so far. Daniel's consciousness snapped back like a rubber band stretched too thin, his senses reawakening in a violent rush. He was no longer restrained. No longer on the cold metallic surface of the examination room. Instead, he was standing. His legs wobbled beneath him as he struggled to process his new surroundings. The walls were gone, replaced by an impossible vastness, stretching infinitely in all directions. There was no ceiling, no floor, yet he wasn't floating. He was somewhere, but the concept of place itself felt distorted, warped by forces beyond human perception. The silence was absolute. Then, the first illusion shattered. The ground beneath him formed, not in a natural way, but as if reality itself was being constructed around him. A forest materialized out of the void, trees sprouting like ink spilling in water, their branches stretching toward a sky that had not existed a moment before. The air filled with the scent of damp moss, of pine, of something almost familiar, but it was wrong. The colors were too sharp, too vivid, like an artist had oversaturated a painting, and the sky overhead pulsed with an unnatural luminescence. Daniel turned sharply, trying to find any sign of the beings who had brought him here. But he was alone. A low whisper rippled through the air, vibrating in his bones. "Show us." It wasn't a request. The forest twisted. Shadows bled from the trees, coiling like tendrils, shifting into forms that made his stomach lurch. Faces flickered within the darkness, familiar yet distorted, their eyes hollow pits of nothingness. His mother. His brother. Friends he hadn't seen in years. They emerged from the trees, their lips moving without sound, their bodies flickering as if caught between dimensions. Then they began to speak. Not with voices, but with memories. Images flooded Daniel's mind, his childhood, his first heartbreak, the moment he held his father's hand as he took his last breath in the hospital. But it wasn't just memories being replayed, it was altered. The details twisted, warped, turning his most sacred moments into something grotesque. His father's hand, instead of gripping his, was clawed, his eyes hollow voids that leaked inky darkness. His mother's voice, once warm and soft, was now shrill and unnatural, laced with words that had never been spoken. Daniel stumbled backward. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. The beings were testing him. But for what? The whispers intensified, the forest closing in. The air thickened, pressing against him, and suddenly, he wasn't in the forest anymore. The world shifted. He was standing in the middle of a ruined city. Buildings stood like jagged teeth against the crimson sky, their windows shattered, streets cracked and overgrown with twisted, alien vines. Fires burned in the distance, casting eerie shadows against the remnants of civilization. The air was filled with the scent of decay, of something dying. A shadow loomed. Daniel turned and froze. A thing towered over him, its form barely comprehensible. It had no eyes, no distinct features, just an ever-shifting mass of darkness that pulsed and expanded, reaching toward him with grotesque, shifting limbs. It exuded hunger. Daniel's heart pounded. He felt its intent, a crushing wave of despair washing over him. He was insignificant. A speck in the vast ocean of existence. And this was what waited at the edge of the universe. "Why do you exist?" The voice slithered into his mind, each word a dagger of cold certainty. Daniel didn't answer. He couldn't. His lungs burned, his legs refused to move. The air itself turned to liquid, pressing down on him as the creature, no, the entity, loomed closer, its form swallowing the broken skyline behind it. This was not part of his world. This was something else entirely. Daniel clenched his fists. He didn't know why, but some primal part of him resisted. He would not bow. He would not surrender to something he didn't understand. The moment the thought solidified, the world fractured. The city collapsed into itself, the sky tore open like fragile fabric, and Daniel was yanked backward at impossible speed, ripped from the vision like a marionette cut from its strings. He was falling. No, he was being pulled back. The beings were there again, watching, observing. He was back inside the ship, or at least something resembling it. His body trembled as his mind reeled, the aftershocks of whatever had just happened leaving him gasping for breath. The tallest being stepped forward. "You resist." There was no malice in the statement. No judgment. Just an observation. Daniel stared back, defiance flickering in his exhausted eyes. The being tilted its head slightly. Then, without another word, Daniel felt the world pull away again. He was being cast out. Or worse, he was being returned. The air around him collapsed. One moment, Daniel was weightless, floating in the suffocating void of the alien craft, his mind raw from the visions, his body drained from whatever they had done to him, and the next, he was falling. Fast. The force yanked him downward, as though an unseen hand had severed its hold on him. His limbs flailed as the blackness around him warped, streaks of blue and violet light flashing past his vision. The sensation was unlike anything he had ever experienced. It wasn't just falling. It was being ejected from a reality he was never meant to step into. A shockwave of cold crashed over him, slamming into his chest with the weight of a collapsing star. His lungs seized, his thoughts fragmented into static, and for a split second, he swore he could hear voices, not in his head this time, but all around him. They weren't speaking in words, but in emotions, thoughts, something deeper. Then, impact. His body hit the ground with a bone-rattling thud, knocking the air from his lungs. The sensation of gravity, of solid earth beneath him, was so abrupt that it took him a moment to comprehend that he was back. The damp scent of soil filled his nostrils. The distant chirping of crickets reached his ears. The wind swept over him, cool and familiar. He was in the field. Right where it all began. Daniel gasped, his fingers clawing at the dirt as he struggled to push himself up. His body hurt. Every muscle screamed in protest, his skin tingling as if it had been doused in static electricity. He rolled onto his back, eyes darting toward the sky. The ship was still there. Hanging in the sky like a silent, monolithic god, the enormous craft pulsed with the same unnatural light that had swallowed him hours ago, if it had been hours. He had no idea how much time had passed. The disc-shaped vessel remained motionless, hovering above the field with an eerie stillness, as if watching. Waiting. Then, without warning, the lights dimmed. The humming sound that had once resonated through his bones faded. The ship shifted, tilting slightly before rising higher, accelerating with an effortless grace that defied everything he knew about physics. Within seconds it was gone, vanishing into the star-strewn sky as if it had never been there. Silence. Real, earthly silence. Daniel remained on his back, staring at the sky, his mind a chaotic mess of confusion, fear, and disbelief. His body ached in ways he didn't understand. His mind felt like it had been rewritten, like something had been taken from him, or worse, something had been left behind. Was this real? Had he truly been abducted? His gaze shifted downward to his hands. That's when he saw it. A mark. A faint, glowing imprint on his right forearm, just below the elbow. The skin wasn't burned, but it felt different, altered. The symbol, an intricate, spiraling shape with jagged edges, was unlike anything he had ever seen. It pulsed softly, as if alive. Panic clawed at his chest. He scrambled to his feet, his knees nearly giving out beneath him. Was his truck still where he left it? He turned, heart pounding. It was there. Sitting in the distance, exactly where it had broken down. The cab light was still on, a distant beacon in the darkness. Daniel staggered toward it, each step feeling heavier than the last. His legs burned, his lungs ached, but he kept moving. The field felt endless, stretching farther than it should, as if reality itself was still reassembling around him. The air was thick with something invisible, something that made his skin crawl. When he reached the truck, he yanked the door open, collapsing into the driver's seat. His hands trembled as he reached for the keys, still in the ignition. He turned them. The engine roared to life. His breath hitched. The truck had been dead before. He had tried everything. The battery was shot. But now it was running as if nothing had ever been wrong. Daniel sat there, gripping the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He needed to leave. Now. Throwing the truck into drive, he slammed his foot onto the gas. The tires spun against the dirt before launching forward, kicking up dust as he sped down the road. His eyes flicked between the road and the rearview mirror, expecting to see something, another flash of light, another impossible shift in the air. But there was nothing. Just the dark, empty road stretching ahead of him. His mind raced. Had they let him go? Or had he escaped? The thought gnawed at him, planting seeds of doubt in the fragile fabric of his sanity. He didn't remember escaping. He didn't remember fighting his way out. He had been sent back. But why? And what was the mark on his arm? Daniel tightened his grip on the wheel. He wasn't sure if he had returned as the same person who left. Something had changed. Something was wrong. And deep down, he had the sinking feeling that whatever had happened on that ship wasn't over. The truck rattled as Daniel sped down the dirt road, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. His heart was still hammering in his chest, the surreal images of the past few hours. Or was it longer? Flashing in his mind like jagged lightning. His body ached, his skin tingled with a sensation that felt wrong, but more than anything, his mind felt stretched, altered, as if something had rewired him from the inside out. The glowing mark on his arm pulsed softly under the dim light of the dashboard, an undeniable reminder that what had happened wasn't a dream. He pressed his thumb against it, expecting pain, but felt nothing except a strange warmth beneath his skin. He didn't know what it meant. He didn't know if it was part of him now. He drove through the night, not stopping, not thinking beyond the immediate instinct to get away. He didn't even know where he was going. He just needed to see another person, needed to find proof that the world was still the same as it had been before they had taken him. When he finally reached the nearest town, the sun was just beginning to rise, its golden light creeping over the horizon like a hesitant promise of normalcy. He pulled into a gas station, hands still trembling as he killed the engine. Daniel stumbled out, his boots hitting the pavement with more weight than they should have. The world around him felt thicker, as if reality itself was heavier than before. He could feel people around him before he even saw them, the cashier inside, the old man filling up his truck at the next pump, the kid leaning against his bike near the entrance. His mind knew they were there. And that terrified him. He forced himself to move. He needed water. He needed to hear another person's voice. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped inside, the cool air of the gas station washing over him. The cashier, a woman in her 50s, her hair tied back in a messy ponytail, looked up from her magazine. She gave him a polite nod, but as her eyes swept over him, her expression shifted. "Sir, you all right?" Daniel hesitated. He must have looked like hell, sweat-drenched clothes, dirt smeared across his face, eyes wide with exhaustion and paranoia. He opened his mouth to respond, but his throat was dry. He grabbed a bottle of water from the cooler, twisting off the cap with shaking fingers and taking a long drink before answering. I need to use your phone," he finally managed. The woman gestured toward the counter. "Right there." Daniel snatched the receiver, his fingers instinctively dialing a number he hadn't dialed in years. His brother Matt. The only person who might listen. The phone rang. And rang. And rang. Then, "Yeah?" Daniel exhaled sharply, gripping the receiver like it was a lifeline. "Matt. It's me. You need to." "Jesus, Dan, where the hell have you been?" His brother's voice was groggy, irritated. "It's been 3 days. You just vanished." Daniel froze. 3 days. He pulled the phone away from his ear, staring at it as if it had betrayed him. That wasn't possible. He had been gone, but it hadn't felt like days. Hours, maybe? "Dan?" He forced himself to respond. "Matt, listen to me. Something happened. I don't know how to explain it, but I was." His voice cracked. How could he even begin to describe what had happened? "Dan, you sound like you're losing it. Where are you?" Daniel squeezed his eyes shut. "I don't know. A gas station outside of... I think I passed through Billings?" He stopped. Something shifted in the air. That same static sensation prickled at the back of his skull. Through the glass door of the gas station, he saw them. 2 men. Dressed in identical black suits, standing beside a sleek, black car that had definitely not been in the parking lot a moment ago. They weren't looking at him, not yet, but he could feel their presence pressing against his thoughts like a suffocating weight. He wasn't supposed to be talking about this. His pulse quickened. "Matt, listen to me. I think I'm being watched." His brother sighed. "Dan, I mean it." The cashier glanced at him, concerned, but Daniel was already moving, already yanking open the door and stepping outside. The men in black turned their heads in eerie synchronization. They knew. Daniel felt it, a silent message crawling into his brain, a warning not spoken aloud but felt. "You should not remember." His breath hitched. The mark on his arm burned. And then, for the first time since he had returned, he heard a familiar voice whisper in his mind. Not his own. Not his brother's. "They know what you are now." Daniel took a step back, his world tilting beneath him. He had survived an abduction. But he wasn't sure if he had really come back alone.